Good morning. My name is Hugo Retortillo, and I am a student in the Master of Public Administration program at Lincoln Memorial University. Our first presenter for the day is Mr. Justin Allen Rose, a graduate teaching associate from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Mr. Rose is a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Justin Allen Rose was born and raised in Fredericksburg, Virginia. After graduating with a bachelor's in journalism and media production from Cameron University in the spring of 2019, he enrolled at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, as a political science PhD student. His dissertation focuses on how social media use affects partisanship and polarization.
All right, so hi all. Like you said, my name is Justin Allen Rose, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I hope everyone is having a great week, and I'm thankful to everyone who has had a part in creating such a wonderful event. My presentation for you today will cover how social media use, and in particular political social media use, affects individual partisanship, how it affects how individuals feel about candidates, and lastly, how it affects the level of anger a person has towards how the country is going politically. While social media use refers to how often an individual uses social media in general, political social media use refers to how often an individual views political content on these social media sites. For my particular research, I focus on the social media sites Facebook and Twitter due to these sites being the most used within the populace. It was media scholar Marshall McLuhan who first posited that the medium is the message. In other words, it was McLuhan's position that the message itself that is being broadcasted is not as important to understand as the medium by which it is being delivered. We can look all throughout history to see that when a new technology is introduced, individuals are able to use tech technology to push forward a narrative that has had huge ramifications for our lives even today. Early European philosophers such as John Locke and Rousseau were able to use the printing press to help them mass produce a message of individual liberty, which helped revolutionaries evoke a new narrative that was quite contrary to the prevalent narrative of the time, which of course was the notion that kings and queens had a sort of divine right that allowed them to rule over large groups of people. This message of individual liberty and the notion that individuals are born with certain unalienable rights that were spread through the use of the printing press helped spur our own American Revolution, as well as the French Revolution shortly after. Fast forward about 200 years, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt used the radio for practically the first time ever to practically enter into the homes of ordinary citizens in order to help get support for his New Deal policies. One could even argue pretty well that if it was not for the radio mass transmitting of FDR's preferred narrative, then it is possible Congress at that time might not have helped pass those New Deal initiatives to the extent that they did. And then, of course, came the television. The television has been used from its inception to affect our political opinions and beliefs. However, the first televised debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon shows the effects of the first truly mass-produced visual medium on our collective opinion formation. Leading up to the first debate, Nixon was coming off a terrible cold. When he ventured onto the televised set, he was pale, had a stubble, and looked rather sickly. JFK, on the other hand, being the handsome man that he was, looked dashing on camera. In fact, JFK looked downright presidential. This contrast in appearances had a tremendous effect on individuals' opinion on who won the debate. Those who listened to the debate on the radio, when polled, stated that Nixon won the debate. However, those who watched the debate on their television sets stated that JFK won. Those who saw the contrast in appearances between these two candidates formed a completely different opinion than those who did not. It is clear that visuals have a tremendous effect on our opinion forming behavior. Therefore, depending on which medium an individual uses to obtain their news or just political narratives, this could have a great effect on their own opinion forming behavior. And of course, social media is the newest form of medium which is now being used by politicians and ordinary citizens alike to try to change or even keep the status quo within our own political world. This is what I am going to spend the rest of my time talking to you all about, which is what my research squarely focuses on. My research centers around how an individual uses social media and how this use affects their partisanship, candidate evaluations, and their anger. To completely understand how social media use can affect partisanship, candidate evaluations, or even anger, we must first understand how many people use these sorts of sites and even the effects of social media that has been discovered through past research. In 2005, the Pew Research Center reported that only 5% of American adults use social media sites. However, that percentage jumped to 50% in 2011 and even reached 72% in 2020. Moreover, Americans now use social media sites to get their news. In 2020, 59% of Twitter users reported they regularly get their news from these social media sites, while 54% of Facebook users said the same. Many Americans also use social media to engage politically. One recent study suggests that only 44% of Republicans and 36% of Democrats who use social media never post political content. In short, it is quite clear that social media sites, in particular Facebook and Twitter, are now very political. Several researchers saw that individuals who use Facebook and saw a banner on the top of their Facebook newsfeed, which asked them to turn out the vote, sort of a get out the vote like MTV used to do back in the early 2000s, were much more likely to vote than those who did not receive this get out the vote banner. Other researchers found that incumbents, or in other words, those who are running for re-election, tweeted much differently than their challengers. What these past research projects show is that social media is being used in a way by political elites to attempt to gain or even shift power, and social media has the ability to have great effects within our political world just by us using them. To understand why political social media use is able to influence one's partisanship, we must first understand what partisanship is and what can affect what is known as negative partisanship. Partisanship is an attachment to a certain political party, whether that is an attachment to the Democratic Party or even the Republican Party. Thus, if someone asks you what political party do you belong to, and you say the Republican Party, then you have a certain level of partisanship towards the Republican Party, and vice versa if you claim to belong to the Democratic Party. Many scholars, however, describe an individual's partisanship as a form of social identity. This means that partisans are emotionally connected to the well-being of their preferred party. And when their party is threatened either through other individuals stating that their party is maybe wrong, or even other political elites, politicians trying to unseat their political party, they tend to become angry. This anger could turn into what is known as negative partisanship. This term can be broadly defined as the negative feelings a partisan has toward the other political party. Having a high level of negative partisanship means having a very strong negative feelings from the other party which you do not identify with. And so if you identify with the Republican Party and you have high levels of negative partisanship, you drastically dislike the Democratic Party. And if you're a Democrat and have a high levels of negative partisanship, then you have very strong hatred or very strong dislike of the Republican Party. Levels of negative partisanship have increased since the 1980s, but has dramatically increased in recent years. So what could be causing this increase? Numerous studies show that levels of negative partisanship increase when individuals are exposed to media with a heavy partisan slant. In other words, when partisans reside within media echo chambers, or echo chambers, and echo chambers are groups, and mostly can be online or can even be offline, where you just surround yourself with people that pretty much think similarly than you do, and you don't really get opposing viewpoints pretty much ever. And so when partisans reside within these media echo chambers that push stories in line with their partisanship, their negative feelings towards the other party increases. One researcher argues that partisans now more than ever reside in internet news communities that further reinforce their partisan leanings and depict the opposing party quite negatively. Thus, more time online with political media leads to more negative partisanship. While this scholar demonstrates that self-selection in media does affect negative partisanship, they leave open the question of how negative partisanship is affected by individual social media use, which I seek to evaluate within my own research. Social media, which are websites and applications that allow users to create and share content or participate in social networking, has qualities that make it quite unique among media sources, and it is particularly prone to affecting party evaluations. Most importantly, social media leads users into these echo chambers that have the potential to affect negative and even positive partisanship profoundly. So while negative partisanship refers to how you hate the opposing party that you do not belong to, positive partisanship is the opposite, how strong positive feelings you have towards the party that you do identify with. People who use social media, such as Twitter, choose who they follow and get political information from. This leads users to create virtual echo chamber communities. One researcher showed that these echo chambers are so insular that social media keeps people from learning about opposing viewpoints. This view is supported by studies of both Twitter and Facebook. However, attempts to create echo chambers notwithstanding, social media users sometimes do cross paths with people who think differently than they do. I think we can all attest to that on our time on Facebook and Twitter. However, studies have even found that in the rare cases when a person goes outside of their echo chamber and gets exposed to partisan criticism, there's still an increase in their negative feelings about the opposing party. 2 experimental surveys found that individuals exposed to online partisan criticism, that is, negative comments about their party, became more prejudiced towards the in-groups of the party they belong to, and against their out-group, the party that the opposing party that they do not have an identity towards. Thus, if a Democrat is exposed to criticism of the Democratic Party online, they tend to become more partisan in their evaluations of both the Democratic and Republican parties. They tend to like the Democratic Party more after being exposed to this criticism and even dislike the Republican Party more. This phenomenon may lead people who are exposed to partisan criticism to think more negatively of the party they do not belong to and even more positively of their own party. In addition to the echo chamber effect, many social media platforms' algorithms push negative posts to the top of users' news feeds. In 2021, former Facebook executives and outside analysts of the Facebook newsfeed showed that the site's algorithms sought to maximize engagement. And of course, social media algorithms are pretty much code that kind of adjusts how people use their sites or even affects what information people see on these sites depending on which sort of code that each Facebook or Twitter uses. So the site's algorithm sought to maximize engagement, and it did this by placing stories and content that received the most attention at the top of these individuals' newsfeed. Now, surprisingly, the content that received the most engagement on both of these sites furthered controversy, misinformation, and even extremism. Twitter algorithm works similarly. In analyzing emotional states present on Twitter, one researcher found that negative moods were more widely present than positive moods. This was especially the case for political tweets, which were disproportionately much negative. Furthermore, other researchers found that political Twitter posts that were emotionally charged were retweeted more often and even more quickly than those that were not. In addition, the most influential political users, or those within the top 50 most retweeted users within these researchers' dataset, posted more emotionally charged tweets than the rest of the users within that same dataset. Social media algorithms do not simply place the most engaging posts at the top of users' news feeds. They also push to the top of news feeds information similar to information users have sought out in the past. Thus, the more political content a user posts or reads, the more political content they receive within their newsfeed. Furthermore, if the user interacts with political content that is more partisan and hostile to the opposite party, and this is the kind of political content most prevalent on social media, they will continue to see this type of content at the very top of the newsfeed when they sign in, whether that be on their computer or even their Facebook and Twitter apps on their phone. Due to all this, I predict that the more time individuals spend engaging with political content on both Facebook and Twitter, the higher they will rate their in party or the party they identify with, and the lower they will rate their out party or the party they do not identify with. The results show that this is in fact the case. I used the 2020 American National Election Study Survey to conduct a simple OLS regression and found that the more an individual interacts with political content on these two sites, the more favorably they rated their own party and the more negatively rated the opposite party. So if you're a Democrat, you rated your own party more, and if you're and you rated the Republican Party even less on a scale of 0 to 100, 100 being the most favorable rating you could give one of the political parties, and 0, of course, being the least favorable rating you could give them. However, there is a little nuance between those that identify as a Democrat versus those identifying as a Republican. Political social media use made Democrats feel worse about the Republican Party, but did not affect how they viewed the Democratic Party. But social media use made Republicans dislike the Democratic Party more and like their own Republican Party even more, which is a very interesting finding. While I did not really go into this in my paper, it does open up future avenues for research of why maybe Republicans are more affected by social media or political social media use, I should say. It could be the fact that Republican thought leaders within these sites are more effective in their narrative building and could affect their own users or their own individuals who view their content more than Democratic thought leaders on Facebook and Twitter. Within my analysis, there was also another very interesting, let me go back. There was also another interesting finding. Traditional media usage also had a significant effect on partisanship. For Republicans, Fox News viewership led to an increase in in-party rating and a decrease on out-party rating, which what we would suggest. Republicans who watch Fox News rated the Republican Party more and the Democratic Party less. However, for Republicans, CNN viewership, so when they went outside of their echo chamber, led to a decrease in in-party rating and an increase in out-party rating. So they rated their own Republican Party less, and they rated the Democratic Party more on that 0 to 100 scale. Thus, it seems that a Republican who views a news source that challenges their own in-party's narrative comes away feeling better about the other party and worse about their party. However, for Republicans viewing a network that airs narratives supporting the in-party, so when they watch Fox News, makes it like the in-party more and the out-party less. And there was also a substantial decrease in the party differential among Republicans who watch CNN. Thus, it seems that if partisans went outside of their echo chambers, there would be less polarization just out in the general populace. Democrats had similar behavior as well. For Democrats, Fox News viewership led to a decrease in in-party rating and an increase in out-party rating. For those same respondents, CNN viewership led to an increase in in-party rating, but had no effect on how they viewed the Republican Party. And so it seems that we see that to be the case as well. When Democrats went outside of their echo chambers and even watched Fox News, they liked the Republican Party more, but liked their own party, the Democratic Party, less. Therefore, what this tells us is that one way to combat the increase in negative partisanship is to try to get partisans outside of their echo chambers, both online and offline. And this directly contradicts past research, which has found that individuals exposed to divergent opinions increase their attachment to their current ideological positions, which is a pretty big finding. Now, what about candidate evaluations? Does political social media use affect the feelings towards individual candidates like it does for the two major parties? My original thought when I was going to tackle this question was that it might possibly not, due to us living in a more candidate-centered electoral atmosphere. So of course that means that in America, we tend to focus more on the candidate's image and their personality more or less than the party that they are running under, especially in comparison to more European countries, especially the Dutch countries. However, research does show how both traditional media and social media can affect candidate perceptions within individuals. In particular, the tone the media takes when speaking about candidates can both negatively and positively affect individual candidate perception. A couple of researchers found evidence for this as well. However, in their analysis, they found that bad candidate impressions were more effective in changing candidate impressions than good ones. This could mean that the media is better able to negatively affect candidate impressions more than they can positively affect them. Other research conducted found that while traditional media had a limited influence on candidate perception, non-traditional media like talk radio had the most influence on candidate perception. In particular, political talk radio was associated with a positive perception of George W. Bush and a negative perception of Al Gore. However, television entertainment talk shows enhanced the perception voters had of Gore, while it did not significantly affect perceptions of W. Bush. These articles in particular did not theorize why political talk radio negatively affected Gore and positively affected W. Bush, or even why television talk shows positively affected Gore but did not affect Bush. However, I argue the reason for these findings could be due to individuals being able to self-select into the media they consume. We know from past research that individuals do self-select into information which they tend to agree with. And this self-selection has been found to be based on individuals' ideology, their habit, and even their topical interest. Since the media has been found to have an effect on individual opinions, in particular candidate perceptions, self-selection into media could be helping produce these effects as well. Social media, as we know, provides its users the ability to self-select into who they follow, which in turn causes them to self-select into information they have the ability to view on these sites and places them within those echo chamber communities that we discussed previously. These echo chambers then produce communities which could enhance an individual's feelings towards the out-party candidate, as well as the in-party candidate, like I found out for the two political parties. So it could express feelings towards, if you're a Republican, express better feelings towards a politician running under the Republican banner, and decrease the feelings you have, or more negative feelings, increase more negative feelings you have of Democratic candidates. Due to this, I argue that social media use, in particular political social media use, does affect the feelings an individual has towards political candidates of the same party as themselves, so they rate them higher, and candidates that are running under the opposite party's banner, and meaning that they rate them lower. I analyzed how individuals rated House candidates that ran under their own in-party and out-party during the 2020 elections, as well as the presidential candidates for that year, so Joe Biden and Donald Trump. The results show that individuals who engage with political content more often on Twitter and Facebook rated the opposite party's presidential candidate lower, their own presidential candidate higher. So that's what we found out for the political parties as well. So it's sort of the same finding. However, for House candidates, engaging with political content on these two social media sites increased the favorability rating of in-party candidates, but did not have an effect on how individuals rated their out-party House candidate during the 2020 elections. My thought on why it did not affect House candidates is because House elections typically do not get a lot of coverage on social media or even within traditional media, especially in comparison to presidential candidates. So this effect of political social media use might be very much contingent on the fact of whether or not people within their social media echo chambers or in their sphere are actually talking about specific candidates. Because a lot of national Republican and Democratic thought leaders are not really going to really harp on those House elections, those obscure House elections in Nevada, Ohio, and Minnesota, and so forth, like they're all going to be talking about Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Lastly, let us turn to how political social media use might affect the anger one holds about the political reality of America. In June of 2020, 73% of registered voters stated that they were angry about the state of the country. In November of that same year, 59% of Trump supporters and 56% of Biden supporters reported having that same anger towards the state of the country. It is clear that a large number of Americans feel anger towards where the country is currently at. And the party not being in control of the government is not the main cause, since the percentage is so close together, 59% and 56%. This finding, along with the recent headlines about Facebook, lead me to wonder, does political social media use affect an individual's feelings about how things are going within the country politically? Research does show that social media can evoke strong emotions, whether that's by emotional contagion or other mechanisms. The theory of emotional contagion holds that emotions can be passed from one individual to another through the transfer of information. In this theory, emotions are likened to a virus passing from one individual to another. A couple of researchers analyzed 4,739 individuals over 20 years, seeking to discover if one person's happiness could, quote unquote, infect another person. They found that having a friend living within 1 mile who was happy increased a person's probability of reporting they were also happy by 25%. In that same study, the scholars found that when a person claims to be happy, the neighbor's probability of being happy increases by 34%. In all, this study shows emotional contagion at work. Being happy does make other people happy. One study found that rainfall in one geological area directly contributed to Facebook users posting statuses with more negative emotions in that same area, and that this content affecting their friends' statuses to have more negative emotions who lived in totally other cities where there was no rainfall being recorded. In another analysis of Facebook posts, it was found that a post expressing either a positive or a negative emotion could affect the emotional tenor of friends' posts. Overall, these studies show that social media posts can influence emotions, and emotional contagion can happen via social media, whether that be Facebook or Twitter, which I analyzed in these studies. Emotional contagion notwithstanding, we know through research that people who get their news from television and radio experience more negative emotions than people who get their news from newspapers. Second, numerous studies show that mass media can prime individuals and can directly affect their opinions and their world views. Given this research, I believe it is reasonable to hypothesize that social media can shape how individuals feel about what is happening politically. In other words, news consumption via social media can affect individuals' feelings about the political world through emotional contagion or other media effects such as priming or even opinion changing. As I mentioned before, the posts which receive the most engagement and are seen the most are ones which have negative emotions attached to them. Since this is the case, individuals who are subjected to these posts, I believe, will be affected by these emotions and therefore feel angrier about how things are going in the country. However, some individuals who use social media would not be subjected to these posts due to how they use social media. Thus, those who use social media for news and political purposes would be subjected to these posts more. However, those who do not use social media for these purposes will not be subjected to these sorts of posts. So if someone uses Facebook or Twitter for maybe dog or cat to make them laugh, cat content, dog content, they're not going to be really subjected to political posts. So I don't really expect those individuals to have this sort of anger or even less happiness that the people who use social media, Twitter and Facebook for political purpose will have. Therefore, I predict the more one engages with political content on Facebook and Twitter will feel angrier about the political reality of the country and less happy about it as well. Again, I used the 2020 American National Election Study surveys to test these hypotheses through a logit regression. The results showed support for my hypothesis. The more one engaged with political content, the angrier they felt, and the less happy they felt as well. So through research, I found multiple findings. For one, as one engages with more political content on Twitter and Facebook, the more they tend to hate the party they do not identify with, and the more they like their own party. So Republicans tend to like their own Republican Party more, and the more they tend to hate the Democratic Party. And Democrats felt the same about their Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The more they like the Democratic Party, and the more express discontent with the Republican Party. Second, the more one exhibits or interacts with political content on social media, the more they like candidates that run under their party's banner, and the more they hate the politicians who belong to the opposing party. And lastly, the more one engages with political content on social media, the more anger they hold towards the state of America politically. So, what does all this mean? As social media continues to grow in usage, we could see partisanship grow as well as anger one feels about politics within America. This could spell even more trouble for our democracy. The more partisan we become, the more gridlock we might see in Congress, and the more anger one feels might make them be more susceptible to authoritarian political figures. Lastly, it could also spell trouble for how people view our institutions, in particular their legitimacy. Justice Sonia Sotomayor recently spoke out with a warning about the legitimacy of the Supreme Court waning due to more hyper-partisanship within the nomination process. If this does spill over even more within the public, who is to say the people and even the other two branches might ignore future court rulings? So, what are the questions you have for me today?
Thank you so much, Mr. Justin Rose. We will now open the floor for questions and answers, and looks like we've gotten a few already in the chat, so I'll go ahead and read those to you from the audience. So our first question says, does this research include text-only social media posts, or does this also include meme or visual posts?
Yes, and so that's one of the limitations of this research is that I have to rely on self-reported statistics, and the ANS only asks respondents if how often they are on social media, in particular Facebook and Twitter, and how often they post political content. And I use those two variables combined to come up with a new measurement of how an individual or how much an individual looks at or engages with political content on social media. So it's my belief that it's both text, memes, and videos, whatever political content is on social media, that is what they're viewing, and it's not solely only on the text, like let's say tweets or whatnot, or just text words. It's also focused on, let's say, memes that Ted Cruz puts out or memes that Ben Shapiro puts out, and vice versa with the Democratic thought leaders.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and read one more here. How do you think the discussion on false news impacts the candidate perception?
Yeah, I think it has a huge perception, especially I think especially since Facebook is more, if you look at the statistics of Facebook and Twitter, more young crowd is on Twitter and the more older crowd is stationed within Facebook. And we see that fake false news are really rampant on Facebook more. And that could be again, this is just me spitballing here, but I'm pretty sure that, especially I know when I was as an undergraduate, I had a media literacy course to kind of show me how to use social media or how to really interact with the media to understand what they're trying to do, what is false, how to navigate false news to make sure if it's real or not. And maybe the older generation, specifically the older generation that maybe is less educated and not go to college and not have those courses, do not really understand that all too well. And so those false news stories, without being vetted, and even we find out that even I know Facebook now is trying to fact check a whole lot of things. I don't know if you all are on Facebook, see a lot of political content, but you scroll through it and see a fact check banner on certain posts. Those actually have been found to increase partisanship as well. And so when somebody sees those those fact checks saying that the post they share was wrong, it's like they even believe that post even more, saying, okay, they're out to get my beliefs, they're out to get my kind of political party, whether that be Democrat or Republican. So I think the discussion over false news is very important to understand and to see how, whether this false news, which is being propagated by individuals here in the United States or even other countries, other maybe dictatorships, and Vladimir Putin, what have you, it's going to affect partisanship and how we interact with each other politically within the general populace.
Yeah, and there's another actually question very related to this, which is, what's your opinion on certain social media outlets such as Twitter restricting or banning some political figures and speech?
Yeah, and so that is a tough question, especially depending on what the different thought leaders are being banned for. And so I get some of them are being banned for false news, some are being banned for hate speech. If we are simply looking at ways to decrease partisanship or decrease anger, I would love to see studies to see how that affects individuals who follow those people's level of anger or level of partisanship. If it's the same as fact checking, and we see that when people are being banned from Twitter, that might increase the individual's belief that their opinion is being prosecuted, which could in turn make them feel more anger or make them increase their partisanship leaning towards their own party and the opposite party as well. So it's a very dynamic situation at play. I'm of the belief that, again, these are individual companies. They can do what they like. It's not the United States social media use. It's Twitter's, it's Facebook. These individual companies own policies. but I would like to see, a total free avenue of speech within these sites. But again, if it's hate speech, if it's targeting individuals through hate, it's kind of hard to really vouch for those individuals. And again, I would just really like to see those studies to see how that affects other individuals' anger, even their partisanship, to really have a fully formed opinion on that in reference to these studies that are presented.
Perfect. We have about three more for now so far. So I'll go ahead and read the next one. Do you think that political party social media tactics in House elections will change based on results such as those you find in this research? Maybe to focus on negative perception of a specific candidates?
Yeah, it could. I would assume that if we see a change in political behavior, it's going to be from the top down, from the Democratic, from the Republican Party down, because we see a lot of times that, especially new candidates coming into the picture, they are not very political savvy, especially within House elections, unless they have other political experience. And so they don't really understand how to use social media to the full advantage that they can use it to. And so we tend to see incumbents who are very political savvy, who tend to, be reelected 90 to 95% of the time, really be able to use social media to their advantage. And for instance, I had a talk with Tim Burchant's campaign manager a little while ago to just understand their campaign strategy. And they pretty much said that they don't even want to, because he's an incumbent and because, his seat has been a Republican seat for so long, that he doesn't feel the need to really talk about the opposing candidate at all to bring more attention to them. And so that could be another reason why we tend to see that House candidates don't really have an effect, or individuals' political social media use doesn't have an effect on House candidates, because those incumbents don't want to bring more attention to their opposing candidates, to their opposition. And so maybe that's why we don't see those negative perceptions being really exacerbated like we see with the political parties.
Awesome. The next one is someone in the audience says, during the last election, I saw a lot of animosity on social media between the parties. When I posted my view of opinion, I actually felt attacked. Do you think the ones that were abusive towards me impacted the other party positively?
I'm assuming that he means, or whoever asked that question for themselves, it could be the case, or, oh, okay, his post. It could be, obviously very well, especially if individuals, let's say an individual on Twitter is constantly, just an ordinary individual, not a political party or not even the candidates, was constantly tweeting negatively. Let's say this person's a Republican and they constantly tweeting negative things toward the Democratic Party, and that person calls them out on it. That could, like we said in one of the other studies, we saw that enhance the partisanship of that individual who continues to post when they get those opposing opinions, even if it's not really attacking the Republican Party, it's attacking that person's viewpoint of being negative towards the Democratic Party. And so, yes, I saw maybe people going outside of the echo chambers kind of lessens partisanship. But when we saw that within other studies I've seen within Twitter and Facebook, that when they find those opposing viewpoints, even if it's just, hey, maybe you shouldn't be using negative words as you are, because that's affecting other people's partisanship as well, that still is going to affect their partisan leanings. So it's kind of a catch-22 situation, is what should I do? Should I continue, being on Twitter or Facebook, being exposed to all these negative comments, or should I try to call these people out, or should I just try to watch traditional news, which maybe not really report the news that is always on social media? Because I know when I'm on social media, I get different news than when I watch ABC, CNN, Fox News, what have you. And so it's just, it's a tough situation all the way around in today's really hyper partisanship world that we live in.
Thank you. And I think this is the last question. Are you afraid of political changes and opinions given that newspapers are going out of style? Maybe people will be subjected to only more anger inducing media outlets?
Yes, I can see that justly being the case, especially since, as we see, I know it's just correlation, not correlation, but as we see kind of more people privy to and go towards social media, especially when the older generation is kind of getting phased out to a certain extent, and people who are coming of age politically have always used Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, so they're always is going to be on the social media sites. That's all they're pretty much going to know. And so, especially if I know maybe I used read newspapers a little bit when I was younger, but not drastically. And especially now, I might read a newspaper every now and then on my phone, the Tennessean, what have you. But most of the news, even I get being a political scientist, is through Twitter and Facebook. And so we can, unless social media companies try to change the algorithms, unless individuals really try to understand every other point of view. I don't really want to place this all on the social media companies because, we live in a capitalistic society and they're out to make a profit. And one way to make a profit is to keep people on Twitter and Facebook. One way to keep people on their social media sites is through getting people are posting things that they like to see once they open the app, whether that's anger, whether that's happiness, what have you. And so it's also on us as individuals to really understand that and to not make sure that we're not in echo chamber communities on Twitter and Facebook. We also want to understand, if you're a Democrat, understand Republican viewpoints. You might disagree with it, but that might even enhance your own understanding of the political world by understanding not only what Republicans think, but why they think it. And so if you enter into a conversation with a Republican, if you're a Democrat, you'll be better able to have good conversations, to even maybe, if that's your inkling, to change your opinions because you know why they believe a certain thing. And so you might be able to really, sympathize with them and understand and maybe even change your opinion to a certain extent. So it's not only, I don't really want to blame all the social media companies through this research or through my, presentation. It's also on individuals to make sure we're following every type of point of view to understand the political world that we live in.
All right, and actually we just got one more question that was just asked. What do you think is the best place to get the real news, or do you have an opinion on that?
Yes, I do. I am a real big Hunter S. Thompson fan. He is my favorite author, favorite journalist of all time. And he had a famous quote stating that there's no such thing as objective journalism except for maybe stock market type relations and box scores, meaning that every news source that you read, I'm not saying they're fake news by a long shot. I really hate that term, fake news, but understand that, Washington, I believe is Washington Post, not, or maybe it's New York Times, all the news that fits to print. They can't print every single narrative. They can't print every single viewpoint within the newspapers. Even Twitter, whether that be CNN, Fox News, ABC, CBS, they are on a time crunch. They only have 30 minutes to tell a full newscast, and maybe within that newscast, it only tells you one or two serious news stories. And so it's very important to understand, to really obtain every narrative and to understand, get a full picture of one political event, whether that be an election, whether that be a drastic event that happened in Florida, Tennessee, what have you, is to read as much narratives about that event as possible. And that's from conservative points of view, liberal points of view, and even centrist points of view. Is to get a full picture of a news event, you have to read everybody's points of view. And so you can start to piece together, okay, this news publication left out this point of view. Why did they do so? And maybe that drastically impacts the way you view this political event or whatever took place.
Thank you. So, Justin, where can we find more about you and your work? Just to close up here.
Yes, of course. You can have a WordPress, jrose.wordpress, jroseopinion.wordpress. You can view my articles there. You can go on my Twitter, Justin Allen Rose, just A-N Allen Rose. And then, that's pretty much where you can find my work. I tweet, what my research does, what other political scientists do as well. And just, overall, that's where you can pretty much find my work.
Thank you again, Justin Rose. And our next speaker, please forward.